Hey guys, Mrs. Horn here. We're going to finish up some notes today from chapter 24. And earlier in chapter 24 we talked about how to define what a species is. And there was the biological species concept, and there was the ecological species concept, and there were 5 different species concepts that we went through and defined. And now this part of the chapter is all about how do you get a new species? How does a new species evolve? And the last little bit of notes that I'm going to do on page 17 talks about the time frame. How long does it take to evolve a new species? So let's start off with the definition for allopatric speciation. And I gave this definition to you in class, but you were writing it down not on this page. You were writing it down under the activity for 24.1. But allopatric speciation, the word allopatric means other country, and we can define it by saying that a new population, or I'm sorry, a population will be isolated from the parent population. It will get separated from a geographic barrier, maybe an ocean, a mountain range, a river, a stream, some kind of a geographic barrier that they can no longer get across or fly across or jump across. They can't walk to it anymore. The island biogeography activity is a great example of allopatric speciation, that they're separated so far from each other that they don't actually make it back to their parent population. And then I have here the mountain range as an example. That's not something that's going to pop up really quickly, so this is something that takes place over a really long period of time. The barrier doesn't have to be that big, but if you're talking about a population of ants, then a small stream might be a barrier that's big enough that would separate the two populations. If you're talking about a bird, then a barrier would be a little more significant, maybe a large lake, like Lake Ontario, or maybe something even bigger, maybe hundreds of miles of ocean would be a barrier that would keep birds from its parent population. Populations that are prone to this type of speciation, populations that are very small, and ones that are very isolated. The term adaptive radiation, we talked about this in class. We use the term adaptive evolution, but adaptive radiation is when lots of different types of species originate from one common ancestor. So if you think of an evolutionary tree and the common ancestors at the bottom, all of the branches off of that tree would evolve into a new organism, a new species, and that image is a great example of adaptive radiation. The Hawaiian Islands, the Galapagos Islands are 2 examples of island biogeography where the common ancestor originated from the mainland and made new roots, per se, in these island communities. And once the environment proved to be very different, then certain traits and certain mutations became beneficial on that island when they weren't so beneficial on the mainland. And the Hawaiian Islands and the Galapagos Islands are really good examples of that. In class, I also briefly mentioned sympatric speciation, and sympatric means same country. And this is where a population becomes a new species without having that big geographic separation, that big geographic barrier from the parent population. It could simply be the development of a new reproductive barrier. I mentioned the term polyploid in class. This is where there's an extra set of chromosomes. If that were to occur because of a complication during meiosis and the offspring were viable, then some individuals in the population may have a whole extra set of chromosomes and can no longer reproduce with the original population that had only the single set of chromosomes. This is pretty common in plants. There is a species of frogs that has happened with, but the polyploid example is not very common. Something else that might happen is they might start to reproduce at different times of the year or different seasons. Another sympatric speciation example might be at different habitats within the same geographic area. So the example that I have here is that the population could become reproductively isolated due to a change in habitat, like I said. Maybe they start eating different foods, so now they're hanging out in different areas, or other resources not used by that parent population. So it's the sympatric, it means same country because they're still in the same geographic area, but there's something within that area that's now keeping them apart. So the last section of chapter 24 talks about the time frame. How long does it take to evolve a whole new species? And there's two terms that I want to explain here, and one is punctuated equilibrium and the other is gradualism. Punctuated equilibrium is when species diverge in rapid spurts of change, and then it goes for a long period of time with nothing happening at all. Gradualism is the type of change that's slow and gradual, and it comes from a common ancestor, and there are little changes that happen over a really long period of time. But there's always changes happening. There's never a dull moment. There's always little changes every generation. The diagram I have here is a good picture of that, and this first model here is an illustration of punctuated equilibrium. Here's our common ancestor, and it shows that from that common ancestor, two different species of butterflies evolved very quickly. You don't see there's nothing in between. So mutation formed that species, and another mutation formed that species, and then that species of butterfly stayed the same for a really long time. So nothing happens for a while. That could be a million years between this point to this point, and there was nothing happening. Nothing changes in terms of mutations. Whereas the second example, the second picture, this is gradualism. So here's your same common ancestor, and then over time there's slight differences, even more of a difference, and now we have a new species here that looks different from the original and may not be able to reproduce with the original population anymore. And then the same might happen for this branch down here. But there could be multiple branches, and the branches are usually drawn at diagonals, indicating that time is passing and small little changes are happening over a long period of time. So that covers everything from chapter 24, and I hope this helps.